is the apocalypse now. The difficult Duchess's worst nightmare has come true. Her response to her father's life or death drama.
Harry called Archie his African little...
Imagine a story that no one saw coming. A royal family caught in a web of secrets, where the truth about their most precious member, a newborn, could change everything. What if the birth of Archie wasn't the simple, joyous occasion we were all led to believe? What if, buried in the depths of this story, was a truth so powerful it could shake the monarchy to its core? This isn't just a royal scandal or celebrity gossip. It's the untold story of a birth that may not be what it seemed, with implications that could alter the very foundation of the monarchy. For years, they've built a flawless image, but now, cracks are beginning to show. The first tremor didn't erupt from a courtroom, nor did it resonate from the polished balconies of a palace. It began instead in the quiet, almost imperceptible corners of Westminster, a place where decisions are usually made behind closed doors, away from the flashing lights of the public eye. It was a subtle stir, a ripple that went unnoticed by many, but for those who were paying attention, it was something far more significant. There was no grand announcement, no fanfare to mark the moment. A procedural motion quietly filed, sealed and stamped in the dead of night on a Thursday evening, after most of the staff had already left for the day. The corridors of power were empty. The usual clatter of keyboards and murmurs of conversations faded away, and the halls, typically alive with the constant movement of officials and aides, stood eerily silent. The motion itself wasn't labeled as anything that would cause alarm. There were no words like urgent or explosive on the file. The label simply read, "Administrative Clarification." To the casual observer, it would have seemed like any other routine paperwork. But for those who understood the intricacies of Westminster's inner workings, for those who knew how these things were carefully calculated and handled, it was clear. The implications, though understated, were far from administrative. They were, in fact, far more consequential than anyone could have imagined. Hidden beneath the guise of mundane bureaucracy was a document that, once read, would set in motion a chain of events that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. What seemed like an innocuous filing in the late hours of the night was actually the beginning of something much larger, an inquiry, a challenge to the very narratives that had been built around the royal family. It would start with a single, seemingly inconsequential question, but once it was raised, it could never be put to rest quietly. This was the moment the storm began to form, the first ripple that would soon become a wave of uncertainty crashing through the palace and beyond. And it all started with a piece of paper labeled Administrative Clarification. A verification inquiry had been set in motion. It wasn't a spectacle for the public eye, nor was it a clash of opposing forces. It was a matter of strict protocol. An official review, quiet and unassuming, yet brimming with potential consequences. And at the heart of it all wasn't Meghan Markle, as many would expect. No, it was Archie, the name that stirred the most concern. Sources confirmed that the inquiry was launched within hours of Tom Bower's now infamous comment at a London literary event. A remark that, once spoken, would forever alter the trajectory of the unfolding drama. The veteran journalist, known for his calculated demeanor, had leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto the audience with that familiar, piercing, fox-like stare that always seemed to unnerve those who met it. The room held its breath, the kind of tension that only comes from the weight of what's about to be said. Then, with an air of complete calm, he spoke, a stark, deliberate statement that would have an immediate ripple effect. The public, Bower said, his voice steady, yet heavy with implication, has never been told the truth about Archie's birth.
Think so. William's very matter of fact, but let's...
But here's the thing no one's talking about. This story goes far beyond just questions about Archie's birth. What if the real scandal isn't about the child at all, but about everything the monarchy stands for? The lies, the cover-ups, the illusion of perfection. We've only just scratched the surface. What happens when the truth, long hidden in the shadows, finally steps into the light? You won't believe where this is going. The words hung in the air, quiet but deafening. There was no shouting, no grandiose performance, just a simple, unembellished truth poised to change everything. In that instant, the atmosphere of the room shifted. What had started as a casual discussion transformed into something far more charged, as if the very air had thickened with uncertainty. The implications of those words were far-reaching, and everyone in that room, whether they realized it or not, understood that a shift had begun. What followed wasn't just speculation. It was a slow burn of questions, of doubts, of a storm gathering in the shadows. And with Bauer's calm declaration, the inquiry into Archie's birth was set into motion. "The public," he said, his voice a perfect balance of calm and chilling composure, "has never been told the truth about Archie's birth." There was no shout, no dramatic flair, no attempt to sensationalize the gravity of his words. He spoke with a quiet authority that seemed to carry more weight than a loud declaration ever could. Each word landed with deliberate precision, hanging in the air like an accusation, subtle, unresolved, but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of statement that demanded an immediate response. Instead, it simply lingered, growing heavier with every passing second, as if the very room was holding its breath. There was a pregnant pause, thick with the unspoken realization of what this could mean. And then, with an almost casual air, he added, "And I'm prepared to defend that statement." The silence that followed was deafening. The room, once filled with the soft hum of murmured conversations, now stood in stark stillness. Those present, even the most seasoned journalists, could feel the shift. The damage had been done in a single moment, one that would resonate far beyond the confines of that room. Within hours, the British media exploded, its headlines feeding the fire that had just been ignited. By morning, the American networks had caught wind of the story, amplifying the already swirling storm. By midday, social media was set ablaze, speculation, disbelief, outrage, and denial all flowing in every direction. The story was everywhere, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. But beneath this overwhelming public frenzy, something far more insidious was unfolding. While the world was caught in the whirlwind of headlines and hashtags, a quieter, more subtle process was at work, one that no camera could capture, no journalist could document. It was a slow, methodical unraveling, an inquiry quietly initiated, almost unnoticed by the masses, but one that carried far greater implications than anyone could have anticipated. This wasn't about a fleeting scandal. This was about something far more dangerous, the fragility of truth itself, and what happens when that truth begins to crumble beneath the weight of doubt and suspicion. The frenzy outside the walls of Westminster may have been loud, but the true storm was happening in the halls of power, far from the spotlight. Inside those walls, questions began to mount, questions that could not be easily answered, and that, once asked, could not be ignored. And while the world obsessed over the headlines, the real question, the one that had yet to be answered, was whether the monarchy itself could survive the storm that was now gathering around it. The whispers were starting, quiet at first, but growing louder. Could the carefully constructed image of the royal family withstand this new inquiry? Could the truth remain hidden, or was it finally time for it to be revealed? In the United Kingdom, certain claims don't need to be proven to set something in motion. They don't require hard evidence or indisputable facts. What they require is something far more elusive and far more dangerous: concern. Concern is a quiet force, subtle but powerful, that can ripple through even the most secure institutions, sparking action before anyone fully understands its scope. And concern, like a shadow creeping under the door, is exactly what reached Kensington Palace the following afternoon. But this wasn't the usual delivery. There was no trusted courier, no royal aide bearing the weight of official correspondence, no royal insignia or high-ranking seal on the envelope. Instead, a plain, unmarked package appeared at a private entrance, an anonymous, almost unassuming delivery. No logo, no return address. Just a simple, handwritten note scrawled in uneven ink across the front. It didn't need to say much. The words alone carried the message: for the future of the monarchy. Open personally. There was no ambiguity in those words. It wasn't a casual delivery. It was a directive, a warning, and a call to action all in one. The message was clear. This was a matter that required immediate attention, and it was too important to be handled by anyone but those at the very center of the monarchy. For Prince William, the weight of those words was immediate. Inside that nondescript package, he would find something far more unsettling than a mere letter. It was the start of something much larger, a quiet, insidious storm that had already begun to brew. Prince William did exactly as the note instructed. He opened the package, and inside, according to sources close to the palace, was a thick dossier, unadorned, with no logos or official letterhead to indicate its origin. It was just a collection of pages, each one meticulously organized, each one brimming with information that was both troubling and revealing. There were timelines, precise and exacting, laying out every moment surrounding Archie's birth. Photographs, some public, some private, some taken in fleeting moments that now seemed to carry a different weight. Anomalies, carefully noted, pointing out small but significant inconsistencies in the narrative that had been so carefully constructed over the years.
Like becoming a new mum, and tell us a little bit about baby Sussex, as we're calling him.
He did.
But what made this dossier so unsettling wasn't just the content, it was the tone. The witness accounts, for example, were not bold declarations or assertions of wrongdoing. They weren't statements meant to accuse, but rather to question. They were carefully phrased, not as conclusions, but as openings, inviting further scrutiny, demanding clarification. And then on the very first page was a title that caused William's stomach to lurch. It wasn't just a title, it was a stark reminder of how fragile the foundation beneath them was. Archie Mountbatten-Windsor, a timeline review. That was when the gravity of the situation truly hit. This wasn't merely a review of events. This was an investigation, a systematic look into the details of something that, until now, had been regarded as part of the family's private narrative. And with every page William turned, the questions grew sharper, the implications clearer. What followed was not a simple inquiry. It was a deep dive into the discrepancies, the gaps, and the uncertainties that had, until this point, been quietly swept aside. The monarchy's future was now intertwined with these questions, and for the first time, William could feel the weight of it all. What followed wasn't a direct accusation of wrongdoing, but something far more unsettling. It was a collection of inconsistencies, each one subtly undermining the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. There were dates that didn't align, key moments that should have been concrete, yet somehow they shifted when examined more closely. Public statements once made with authority contradicted each other, leaving a trail of confusion in their wake. Hospital references, seemingly simple details, varied depending on who was asked, creating an unsettling ambiguity about the most basic facts. Some announcements, which had once been regarded as definitive, were quietly amended after the fact, as if someone was trying to rewrite history before it was too late. But it wasn't just the facts themselves that raised doubts. It was the language. The way the palace spokespeople had chosen their words, passive, unusually careful, almost deliberately imprecise, seemed to intentionally leave room for interpretation. It was the kind of language that avoided absolutes, that treaded lightly around difficult subjects, and that, in its hesitance, seemed to suggest there was more to the story than anyone was willing to admit. Each carefully worded sentence, each small omission, now stood as a glaring red flag. It wasn't just the information that was missing, it was the way the information was being presented. And with every page William turned, the unease grew. This wasn't merely a collection of questions about Archie's birth. This was a narrative that had been crafted, layer by layer, to hide the truth beneath a shroud of carefully chosen words and half-truths. The deeper he went, the more it became clear. The foundation of their story was cracking, and nothing could hold it together for much longer. The file didn't make bold claims like, "This is false." No, it was far more calculated and subtle. It simply stated, "This does not align." And in the world of the royal family, where every action, every word, and every document is scrutinized for its exactness, alignment is everything. It's not just about having the right facts. It's about presenting them in a way that fits the larger, carefully constructed narrative. In a family where tradition and precedent hold more weight than almost anything else, the slightest misalignment doesn't just raise questions. It creates a ripple effect that can destabilize everything. The phrase "does not align" was like a crack in a perfectly polished surface. It wasn't an outright denial, but it suggested something much more insidious. That something was off, that something didn't fit, and that the story being told might not be as cohesive or as truthful as everyone had believed. In royal matters, where appearances and precision are paramount, such discrepancies are more than just administrative oversights. They are signals that something is wrong, and once those signals are noticed, they cannot be ignored. And now, with that simple, quiet statement, "This does not align," the stakes had been raised. A subtle yet powerful challenge had been laid down. The integrity of the royal narrative, built over generations, was now in question. And for a family whose entire identity is built on an image of unity, consistency, and unbroken tradition, that was a threat no one could afford to ignore. One section of the dossier focused on the Portland hospital announcement. The timing, the phrasing, and most troubling of all, the glaring absence of the customary medical confirmations that should have accompanied such a high-profile birth. In a world where every royal moment is carefully documented and verified, this omission stood out like a scar on an otherwise pristine record. There was no official statement Fr. Own medical staff, no routine confirmation of the birth from the hospital itself, a standard practice in every other royal delivery. It was an unsettling silence that demanded explanation. Another section brought attention to photographic anomalies from the pregnancy period. But these weren't being presented as outright evidence of deception. No, that would be too direct. Instead, they were highlighted as visual irregularities, small inconsistencies that had raised internal questions over the years. Photos that didn't quite match the timeline, shots that seemed to have been taken under odd circumstances, or pictures where the details didn't add up. These discrepancies weren't about proving guilt, but about raising doubt, about suggesting that something wasn't as it seemed.
Or just posting a lot more pictures. It has drawn a lot of attention to the controversies surrounding her kids.
Then came the detail that reportedly froze Prince William in place, the moment that made him stop and stare, unable to move or speak. A witness account, anonymous but chilling in its precision. The witness described a physical detail about Archie, something never released to the public, never photographed, never discussed outside the immediate family. A mark, small, distinctive, and known only to those who had seen the child up close. It was the kind of detail that was so personal, so intimate, that its mention sent a cold shiver down William's spine. He remembered it. He had seen it once fleetingly during a brief family gathering years earlier. A detail so minute that it could easily have been overlooked by anyone who hadn't been paying close attention. But now, here it was, described in exacting detail by someone who shouldn't have known it at all. That was the moment William reportedly froze, the weight of the realization hitting him like a sudden blow. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was far more unsettling than he could have ever imagined. William remembered it. He had seen it only once fleetingly during a family gathering years ago. It wasn't the kind of detail you forget, too unique, too distinct to slip from memory. And yet here it was again, described with unnerving accuracy by someone who had no right to know such a personal detail. It wasn't just a vague recollection. It was precise, as if the witness had been standing right there, close enough to see what only a few ever would. That was the moment, sources say, that Prince William's world shifted. In the quiet of his office, away from prying eyes, he reportedly issued an internal directive. There would be no fanfare, no sudden press statements or royal declarations. Just a simple, quiet order: confirm, cross-check, and review. He instructed the palace staff to dig into the details, to leave no stone unturned, but to do so with discretion. No leaks, no rumors, no assumptions. Just facts and only the facts. It was a direct call for verification, not in the spotlight, but behind closed doors. Because in a family built on secrecy, no question could be left unanswered. But the problem with questions in an institution like this is that once they enter, they don't just fade away. They don't quietly slip into the background or disappear with the passage of time. Once a question is raised, especially one with such high stakes, it lingers, it festers, and like a shadow that refuses to leave, it grows, moving through the halls of power, carrying with it the potential to unravel everything. The walls of the monarchy were built on a delicate balance of truth, trust, and tradition, and now the very foundation of that balance was in danger of cracking. Across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle was unraveling. The headlines hit her with the force of a physical blow, each word landing like a punch to the gut. Tom Bower challenges Archie's birth narrative. Royal baby questions reignite. Parliament sources confirm internal review. The world was suddenly watching, scrutinizing every detail of her life, every claim, every contradiction. Her phone buzzed incessantly, messages from lawyers, advisors, PR strategists, all clamoring for attention, each trying to manage the fallout, each offering their own advice on how to weather the storm. But amid the cacophony, one question echoed louder than the rest. How much do they know? She demanded an immediate legal response. Letters were drafted with cold precision, warnings were issued, and threats of defamation were prepared, a shield against the storm that was now raging in the media. But when Tom Bower's reply came, it was simple, stark, and devastating in its clarity. Proceed as you wish. Discovery benefits truth. The words hit her like ice water. Discovery. The very thing that for years they had carefully avoided. Because discovery, an unrestricted, unfettered search for truth, was the one thing that no amount of media manipulation or narrative control could survive. It was the one thing that exposed everything, laid bare every hidden corner. And in that moment, Meghan realized the magnitude of what was happening. It wasn't just about defending herself against a story. It was about whether the entire carefully curated image of her life could withstand the truth coming to light. Fear began to settle in. Because once the truth was uncovered, once discovery took its course, there would be no controlling the narrative. The story was no longer hers to shape. What made the situation even worse, and what shifted Meghan's anger into something far closer to panic, was Harry's silence. It wasn't just the absence of a statement. There were no public defenses, no reassuring words, not even a quiet leak to friendly outlets to diffuse the tension. For 48 hours, he vanished from the conversation entirely. He was silent, completely absent, and as the hours stretched on, commentators began to take notice. Oh, did the public? What kind of father says nothing? One headline asked. Is silence protection or is it admission? Asked another. The questions grew louder with each passing hour, the speculation intensifying, but Harry remained out of sight, leaving everyone to wonder. Why wasn't he speaking? Why wasn't he defending his family when everything was on the line? His silence wasn't just a personal choice. It became a symbol, a powerful statement in itself, and not the kind of statement Meghan had ever hoped for. Meanwhile, in London, the political side of the story was unfolding at a pace that the media had yet to fully grasp. The inquiry that had quietly begun wasn't about scandal or sensationalism. It wasn't about pointing fingers or creating drama. Insiders made it clear. This wasn't about salacious gossip. It was about something far more fundamental: constitutional clarity, lineage, documentation, and precedent. There had been no direct accusations made, but questions had been raised. And once questions are raised, once doubts take root in an institution as powerful and as old as the monarchy, they cannot simply be erased. They linger, building pressure, silently demanding resolution. The wheels of investigation were turning, quietly but relentlessly, and nothing could stop them now. Back in California, the pressure finally cracked something deep inside. A strange new rumor began to spread, one that, unlike many others before it, seemed to have the weight and persistence to grow legs. This rumor felt different, like it might actually stick. Could it be, as so many had begun to suspect, that Harry and Meghan were lying about something?
Birth certificate, it shows Archie Harrison Mountbatten.
As the walls of their carefully constructed narrative began to crumble, Meghan, in a tense, off-the-record exchange, reportedly confronted Tom Bower directly, using intermediaries as a buffer. The conversation that followed was charged with raw emotion, an unfiltered exchange that laid bare everything she had tried to keep hidden. It was unguarded, filled with frustration, fear, and desperation. And in that moment, something slipped. Not a confession, not an admission of guilt. Just a phrase, a small, seemingly insignificant slip of the tongue that would come to haunt them. The woman who gave birth. It wasn't a deliberate revelation. It wasn't an overt admission of anything wrong. But in the world of tightly controlled narratives, this small, seemingly innocent phrase was enough. It was a crack in the facade. A small but significant slip that suggested there was more to the story than anyone had been told. It wasn't what was said that mattered. It was what was unintentionally revealed in that fleeting moment of vulnerability. And just like that, the story shifted again. What had once been a carefully curated narrative now had a crack in it. A crack that, if explored, could expose the truth they had so carefully kept hidden. The sentence stopped there, hanging in the air. But in narratives like this, it's never the words themselves that carry the most weight. It's what they unintentionally reveal, the subtle truths that slip through the cracks of a perfectly crafted story. From that moment on, the story evolved. It was no longer about gossip or idle speculation. It became about records, about verification, about what happens when a meticulously managed narrative runs headlong into an institution built not on perception, but on documentation, on hard facts, dates, and unalterable truths. The monarchy's strength lay in its history, in its unyielding foundation of rules and records. And now, that foundation was being tested in ways it hadn't been for generations. Somewhere between the quiet, shadowed corridors of Westminster and the pristine, sunlit halls of a Montecito mansion, an empire built on perfect appearances and curated narratives. The question no one wanted to ask aloud began to take shape. Not who is Archie? That was the question on everyone's lips. But the true question, the one that threatened to unravel everything, was how much of the story was ever complete, how much had been carefully constructed for the public, and how much had been shaped by careful omissions, by silence, by carefully chosen words that protected a version of reality. In the quiet of those darkened halls, the real question loomed larger with each passing day. And once it took root, there was no turning back. Weeks passed, and with them the speculation grew louder, the whispers turning into open questions. The public waited breathlessly for an answer. And then finally, after months of uncertainty and tension, a statement emerged from Buckingham Palace. It wasn't a fiery rebuttal. There were no accusations, no names mentioned, no promises of legal action. It was quiet, almost muted, just a brief, carefully worded acknowledgement that certain inconsistencies surrounding Archie's birth were under review. It was a statement that spoke volumes by saying so little. The monarchy, the institution that had survived centuries of scandal and turmoil, was now caught in the crosshairs of a quiet investigation. The question of truth, once a whisper in the background, had finally been brought to the forefront. And there, in the space between the words, was the sound of something shifting, something irreparably broken, never to return to its former state. The world read between the lines, and the consequences were immediate. Markets reacted with sharp, visible tremors. Headlines exploded across every platform, each one more dramatic than the last. Supporters rallied, defending their chosen side, while critics reveled in the unfolding drama, seizing the moment to deepen their attacks. And somewhere in the midst of it all stood a little boy, Archie, whose life had been thrust into the center of a storm he never asked for. His name, once a symbol of royal joy, had become a symbol of uncertainty, of a family's unraveling story, and of a monarchy struggling to maintain its carefully constructed facade. The monarchy itself didn't crumble, but it shifted, irrevocably. Hard truths, long whispered about in private corners, were now brought into the harsh light of day, forcing reforms that had been feared for years. The strength of the royal family was built on trust in its continuity, its ability to withstand scandals and maintain its position at the heart of the British establishment. That trust was now shaken, fractured by the cracks in the story. But like a house slowly being rebuilt after a disaster, it wasn't destroyed completely. It was rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, piece by piece, as the monarchy tried to repair the damage done. As for Meghan, she disappeared. Art from the spotlight. The fierce public figure who once seemed so unstoppable retreated behind layers of lawyers, legal documents, and NDAs. Her Hollywood comeback, once touted as inevitable, stalled, not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible fading. Her presence, once ubiquitous, became increasingly rare, and the public's attention shifted, moving on to the next headline, the next scandal. Harry, too, retreated. Now living in California, far from the relentless glare of the British press, he became quieter, more introspective. His focus shifted to his children, the life he had built away from the royal spotlight, rather than the headlines that once consumed him. As for Tom Bower, he published one final chapter, not with triumph or gloating, but with a stark, sobering warning. Power built on illusion always collapses. It was a reminder that no matter how carefully a narrative is constructed, no matter how tightly it is controlled, truth will always find its way to the surface. And when it does, it exacts a price, no matter how delayed or obscured. The curtain fell, the drama seemingly over. But the echoes of that moment lingered, reverberating through every corner of the royal family, through the press, and through the public's consciousness. This was proof, as undeniable as it was painful. Even the most carefully constructed fairy tales can't survive when reality finally knocks on the door, demanding to be heard. Now that you've heard this untold side of the story, here's the big question. Can the monarchy survive this? Can they repair the cracks that have started to show, or is it too late to rebuild what's been broken? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if you want to know what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This story isn't over, and neither is the truth.